Welcome, everyone. This is Carmen Sanchez from the Office of Special Education Programs, and we will be starting the webinar momentarily. We're waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. Here we go. So I want to do some reminders before we start actually getting into the content. All participants will be muted. We will be using the chat space for questions. You notice here we have a link. It's also in the chat space for captioning. Should you need captioning, please follow that link and the Federal Relay Service caption will start. They're already on the call, so you will have that as a separate screen. Those of you who have not had a chance to read the Dear Colleague letter, the stakeholder brief, we just have a link there too. That was also sent with your registration information. Next slide. Like I said, this webinar is on the OSEP Dear Colleague letter on behavior, and we're going to be hearing from quite a few people. It is starting now. We are slated to be on for approximately 75 minutes until 3:15 Eastern Time. Welcome again to this webinar discussion of the Dear Colleague letter on behavior. The letter was issued on August 1st, 2016. As I said, I'm Carmen Sanchez, a project officer in the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. Again, before we begin, I want to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and archived on the Ideas That Work website. All participants will remain muted during the course of the webinar in order to assure the highest possible sound quality. If you have a question, please use the chat space to type in your question, and we will get to as many as time allows. There is two different kinds of chat spaces. You can put in the chat space and address it to everyone, which means everyone will see it, or you can address it to the presenters only, and only those who are listed as presenters will be able to see your question if you wish to remain relatively anonymous. If you need captioning, I've already said put it in the chat space. You'll see how you can get to that captioning. Now I will turn it over to Nancy Reeder at the National Association of State Directors of Special Education to start the webinar and go over the agenda. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon and taking this time out of your busy schedules. This webinar is an opportunity for state directors, protection advocacy systems, parent training and information centers, and community parent resource centers to learn more about the Dear Colleague letter that OSEP issued on August 1, just last month. It's also an opportunity to discuss how the letter may affect your work with students and families, particularly around issues with suspensions and expulsions and more informal removals from the classroom and learning. We have with us today Dr. Renee Bradley from OSEP, who is well known for her work on behavior and students with disabilities. She's been the project officer for the Positive Behavioral Supports and Intervention National TA Center, better known as the PBIS Center, since its inception almost 20 years ago. Renee's really not that old, but she started when she was a little kid. After Renee provides an overview of the Dear Colleague letter and answers some questions, Diane Smith-Howard from the National Disability Rights Network and Chris Kiranen from the Michigan Protection Advocacy System will discuss informal removals of students with disabilities. Todd Lofton is the Director of Special Education for the Oklahoma Department of Education, and Sharon House is the Executive Director of the Oklahoma PTI, and they will talk about their state's experience in changing how they address behavior. We hope to address any questions or comments that were not discussed between presentations at the end of the presentations. Finally, Deborah Jennings from the Center for Parent Information and Resources will discuss additional resources you may find helpful with your work. So without further ado, I'm turning this over to Dr. Renee Bradley. Thank you so much, Renee.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks to everybody for asking me to join you today. And I've been given 15 minutes, which is 5 minutes longer than last time I did this for another webinar last week. So if you're hearing me again, I apologize, but hope to make it a little bit different. I want to begin by saying I am not a lawyer, never have wanted to be, nor studied at all to be a lawyer. I'm a behaviorist, which is probably worse. And I've been working with kids with emotional and behavioral disorders for almost 30 years now. So Nancy, I am getting up there in age. And I was just going to put this in context real quick before we start. Is one day, my favorite story to tell about my daughter is her jumping up and down on a chair in the living room, and I peeked out from around the kitchen, and she said to me, "Look, Mom, I'm making really bad decisions." And then another time, my son came home from 3rd grade, having had a first-year teacher, which ended up being a phenomenal blessing, and he is still an incredible teacher. But my son comes home from the first week of school and says, "Mom, Mr. Hood needs your help really badly. There are so many kids that need behavior plans." So with that as a background, I just want you to know that I've had kids that tend to display inappropriate behaviors in my heart for many, many years. And I fortunately or unfortunately had the opportunity to work on this Dear Colleague letter, and it took at least a year and a half to get through the department, and maybe longer, going back and forth. So it's one of the things I'm most proud of in my time here, and I hope that you see the positives in it as well. So with that said, we're going to kind of launch in. So in a brief, the Dear Colleague letter clarifies the responsibility of IEP teams to include behavior interventions and supports on IEPs for students whose behavior impedes their own learning or the learning of others. And in doing that, to try to prevent the unnecessary removals of students from instruction. It also talks about the failure to consider, which is the language that's in the IEP section of IDA. The failure to consider positive behavior interventions and supports and to provide them appropriately may lead to a denial of FAPE. Just stay on this slide for just a second, and I'm going to insert a couple of other things here. So Secretary King has been, and as well as Secretary Duncan, but Secretary King's been quite a champion of behavior-related issues in his time here in the department. And he emphasizes in almost every single one of his speeches that our priority is to have kids in school and ready to learn. And he is very passionate about decreasing the time that kids are excluded from instruction. And he has said on numerous occasions that it is unfortunate that some of our most needy children seem to be the ones that are excluded the most often from instructional settings. We've kind of come to think about this is think about how we're supporting behavior. If you remember, in October we released a Dear Colleague letter on FAPE that was more academically oriented. And this letter kind of clarifies our intent that just as we would provide supports for academic outcomes and gains for children, we would also be providing the behavioral support. So if we look at supporting early reading, for example, we teach the basic concepts, we use context, we teach children how to use context clues, we work on fluency to increase comprehension. When they fall behind, we give them more practice, extra time, or differentiated instruction. And we need to be doing the same thing for behavior. We need to teach the appropriate skills. We need to have basic school behavior very clear. We need to practice responses to behavior, reinforce them when they're appropriate, and offer more support when they fall behind, not exclude them from the instructional environment. So for the basis of this, and we can go to the next slide, please. For the basis of this presentation, I am focusing on the stakeholder document that we issued along with the Dear Colleague letter. We've gotten several comments in the past with Dear Colleague letters that when they're released that they may not be as clear as some folks would like them to be. So we worked hard to put the kind of main points of this letter and the intent of this letter in some bulleted forms in the letter, in the stakeholder user-friendly guide. And I'm going to use that document as I like it much better, not being a lawyer, to walk through the main parts of this. So as I said earlier, this is focused on effectively supporting and responding to behavior. to focus on making sure that IEPs address supports and services. The letter expands on the responsibilities of IEP teams to address the behavioral supports and to make sure that they are being appropriately implemented. Although we consider this to be significant guidance, it does not add any new legal requirements, and it does not change any of the existing discipline provisions of IDEA. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read each one of these bullets for you, but I am going to do a little highlighting of them. So our focus here, similar to the Dear Colleague letter that focused on academic instruction in October, is we're looking at making sure that children with behavioral needs receive a free, appropriate public education, and that they receive that education in the least restrictive environment. As many of you know, many children with significant inappropriate behaviors, school behaviors, are typically housed in some of our most restrictive settings, and so that was addressed in the letter. The guidance is not intended to limit schools and agencies' appropriate use of disciplinary removals that are necessary to protect children, but we have found that there are many children being excluded from school from very minor infractions, and that those infractions are not typically, the regular person would not look at the majority of those infractions and say that the removal was because of protecting either the student or his peers. We're also very aware from the data that many of the disciplinary removals, that they are far too frequent, and that many of them have come under scrutiny for being of the more informal nature. So please keep Johnny home today instead of an official removal. So we're looking at both of those addressed in the letter. Next slide, please. So this is where some folks have had some prior questions. IDEA requires individualized education program teams to consider the use of PBIS for children whose disability, whose behavior interferes with their learning or the learning of others. And this is where I would say, in my totally non-lawyer voice, that we're kind of expanding what we expect IEPs teams to do. So we want them to look at the history of the behavior of the child. We want them to address any parent concerns about behavior. We want this decision and the inclusion of support services and interventions to not be category specific, i.e. you're a child with a learning disability, so you don't get behavioral objectives on your IEP. Next slide, please. So this slide is focusing on are the behavioral objectives on the IEP. So when a child is displaying inappropriate behavior that results in their removal from an instructional environment, we want to see, does this indicate that behavioral support should be included on the IEP? So if they're not there, we should have them included as part of the IEP. It's especially true when the child is being, that the consequence is a suspension or disciplinary removal, removing them from instruction. So regardless of their disability eligibility category, if they're displaying behaviors that either may result or do result in removing them from the instructional environment, behavior has to be a consideration of the IEP team. So that slide is, are they there? The next slide addresses the fact that a child could display inappropriate behaviors, and they already have an IEP that addresses the behavioral supports. So in this case, we're asking IEP teams to think about two questions. Are the behavioral supports that are included in the IEP appropriate? So are they the right ones? And secondly, are they being implemented the way they're designed to be implemented? So are they there, and then are they being implemented the way that they were designed to implement? And if they're not, if they're there but they're not working, the IEP team should meet and reconsider the behavioral objectives. If they're on there, they're the right ones, but they're not being implemented correctly, then we should look at implementation strategies to ensure that they're being done with fidelity. Next slide, please. This slide talks about the importance of making sure that they are evidence-based practices and that they are individualized to fit the child's needs. Suspension is not an evidence-based practice in any way, shape, or form. So it one-size-fits-all mentality that if a child has a behavioral objective, every child with a behavioral objective in this school is going to get this specific intervention is also not appropriate because it's not individualized. Next slide, please. This slide I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It just goes over some of the examples of different kind of supports. And the next slide talks about the importance of training personnel. So if the IEP is not being implemented, if the supports and services aren't being implemented appropriately, then that becomes a training issue and needs to be addressed. Training could include teaching support teams how to write effective IEPs, what evidence-based practices in behavior exist and how they should be included in an IEP. For example, how to do a functional behavior assessment. Even though that doesn't appear until the discipline guidelines, most of you know that it's very difficult to come up with an appropriate behavior intervention plan for a child without first doing an FBA. Next slide, please. This slide speaks to the evidence that we have that it's important to have evidence-based practices, but if they're delivered in a school-wide framework, that those practices will be more likely to have the impacts that we want. And it sets the school up for what we do for all kids, what we do for some kids, and what we do for the few kids that need the most intensive services. Next slide. This slide talks about, reiterates the least restrictive environment provisions and clarifies that just because a child displays a certain behavior, that does not necessarily mean that they have to go to a more restrictive setting. So here we're looking at displaying certain types of inappropriate behaviors should not dictate the placement in a continuum. If supports and services can be provided effectively in a less restrictive environment, then that needs to be part of the consideration. Next slide, please. This one reiterates again the continuum of placements that need to be available to all children, including children with that have a tendency to display more inappropriate behaviors. The next slide. This is looking at a reminder to schools to use caution in using disciplinary measures that remove a child from his or her current placement, such as suspension. We know this is really not an evidence-based practice, nor is it really an intervention. One of the hallmarks of an intervention is that it may stop the behavior that we don't want to see, but an intervention will replace that behavior with a more appropriate behavior. Next slide. This slide iterates the rights of parents that were reiterated in the letter. Two of those being that parents have the right to request an IEP team meeting at any time, and secondly, that parents may want to request an IEP team meeting following a disciplinary removal or changes in the child behavior that might impede the child or the learning of others, because this will probably indicate that either the IEP objectives are not the appropriate ones or they're not being implemented consistently. And the next slide, please. I have included here the press release, the Dear Colleague letter, and the stakeholder brief links for your reading pleasure. And the following slide addresses two of the documents that we released along with this guidance. These two documents have also been included recently in the releases on school absenteeism, school resource officers, and the OCR guidance. The first, it looks at the blueprint to set up multi-tiered systems of supports within schools. And the second one is a matrix that we did on specific classroom practices. And so with that, my 15 minutes are up, and I think we have time for a few questions if there are any.
Yes, there are quite a few questions. The first one was, so I want to make sure I heard this correctly.
Oh, that's always a bad way to start.
A student with a learning disability is suspended for inappropriate behavior. The IEP team should address behavior on the IEP?
They should consider. They should consider. So what we were trying to say is that oftentimes we have heard that schools and districts will say, we cannot include behavioral objectives on a child's IEP who has a learning disability. That's not accurate. So it is not disability specific. If a child with a learning disability is being excluded from the instructional environment, then because of inappropriate behaviors, the IEP team should meet to consider if behavioral objectives need to be added to the IEP, and if they're already there, if they need to work on how those are being implemented.
Great. The second question is there a rule of thumb with regard to how long you should wait before reconvening an IEP if behavioral supports are not working?
This is a hard one. This is more of a kind of a practice question than one that deals specifically with some of our more guidance documents. But I think this is the work that we have done on behavioral intervention plans. I would say 6 weeks is a good window, but that is always needs to be looked at within the context of what the student is doing, what the school is doing, and what the parents are doing. The good reason for that, using it as a marker, is it gives you enough time to try to get something into place, but we also don't want kids languishing in, if the child is continuing to be excluded from the instructional environment, then something more needs to be done. That really needs to be your marker on this. If there's continued exclusion from instruction, we need to do something to beef up the supports and services that the child is receiving.
Okay. There's a couple more questions, but I think we can hold them till the end. So we're going to turn this over now to Diane Smith-Howard and Chris Kiernan for the P&A system.
Okay. Next slide, please. This is Diane Smith-Howard. I'm with the National Disability Rights Network, and we'll be hearing primarily today from Chris Kiernan, who is an advocate working in our Michigan office. But I wanted to provide just a little bit of background on the topic that we're talking about. We were extremely pleased to see this letter come out because P&As, and there's a slide later on about who the P&As are, but we are legal advocacy organizations, and there's one in every state. And P&As have been seeing over the past few years a real increase in the case of informal removal. And there was not a handy document or a clear and ready statement for us to use at IEP meetings when we encountered informal removal problems. And so we had asked for guidance on this particular topic because we were seeing so many cases with this fact pattern. And Chris will give some good examples of what the fact pattern looks like in a minute. But basically, informal removal is removal of students from school without due process, and it's a violation of Goss versus Lopez, which is the Supreme Court decision that applies due process in an educational setting to all public school students, the IDA in Section 504, and some of the ways that the ways in which we see kids informally removed are those, as Renee mentioned, being sent home in the middle of the school day, being placed on shortened days, a couple hours a day of tutoring either in school or at home, placing the child on homebound with 2 hours a day of tutoring, or transfers to programs that are not properly accredited or do not have certified staff. So those are some of the kinds of things that we were seeing. And because data is not collected on informal removal, we have had to use anecdotes to sort of get our brain around the issue. But almost every PNA had reported in their state that they had seen these cases, and some had seen a great many. So this guidance document will provide us an opportunity to address some of these fact patterns in a simpler and more straightforward manner that I think will be easier for parents to use. Next slide. So who does it impact? Informal removal, in our experience, seems to impact particularly disenfranchised families, and they tend to be families, people of color, low-income people, and single parents. It's just anecdotally that seems to be who the families who find themselves in this informal removal situation. And it has an impact both on the student and the community, because the student is often home in an unsupervised or poorly supervised setting, which can lead to all sorts of difficulty. You have an unsupervised youth in the community, and in these cases, typically they're kids with behavioral issues who are unsupervised and out and about, not in school. And parents are put, particularly parents who are hourly wage workers, are put in a very difficult position if they need to scramble to provide child care for a child who's not in school. Next slide. So PNA agencies, as I mentioned briefly, are agencies that have the authority to provide legal representation to people with disabilities, and there's one in every state and territory. Next slide. And there are 57 of them, and we have particular powers to file lawsuits on behalf of individuals and to have access to facilities. Next slide. So what we did, just to wrap up before I hand this over to Chris, is we created a national initiative to address informal removal, and we used the power of the PNA network to try to bring some focus to the problem of informal removal by increasing press coverage, media coverage, social media coverage on the issue, and then also by filing OCR complaints. And we tried to file an OCR complaint with a fact pattern like this one in almost every district office that we could, because we were finding that there just wasn't sufficient focus on this issue. So I think, Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then it sounds like it might come back to me at the end. But I think the most important thing is to describe what some of these fact patterns look like, so people can really understand what we're talking about here.
Sure. Thanks, Diane. I want you to be thinking about the things that Renee bullet pointed out of the guidance as I talk with you about what I've seen in my work with families in Michigan. The guidance letter starts with some really useful statistics and information that isn't new to any of us about how removal from school impacts children and families, and the statistics are helpful, but I don't work with statistics. I work with families, and I work with children. And so I selected 3 actual students from my casework over the course of the last year or so. I've changed their names to protect their privacy, but these are real students, and everything I'm going to tell you about them is actual fact. The first student that came that I want to bring up with you is a young man named Joseph. Joseph was 8 years old when his mother called, and he's a Native American student who has a history of trauma. There was domestic violence in the home. His mother was subjected to the domestic violence, and Joseph mostly witnessed it, but also was subjected to it himself. And Joseph was receiving treatment through community mental health to help with that trauma history, but the school didn't seem to understand how that was impacting him. He attended a very small rural district, fewer than 800 students in the whole district, not just the school, the whole school district. And he ended up suspended his entire year of first grade for bringing a butter knife to school, which probably was also tied in with his history. The district, to their credit, identified him as having special education needs. First of all, as a student with speech and language impairment, but then soon after, because of his behavior, they identified him as having an emotional impairment. Unfortunately, as is the case with many of the families we work with, identifying him didn't mean that they understood his needs. And so they knew they were supposed to create a behavior plan, and that they did. They created a behavior plan that involved removing him from school as a reward when he exhibited good behavior and sending him home when he exhibited bad behavior. And as a result, he was getting sent home both for good behavior and bad behavior, and his behavior didn't really improve at all. The IEP team did reconvene to address his lack of progress, but with no other tools to work with. What they did was they wrote a program for him, a new IEP, that took him out of school, away from any contact with peers, and placed him in a program where he would receive one-on-one tutoring from his principal after school hours. It also required that his mother attend with him to make him work. And the program that they set upon required her to intervene to make him work, or they would disengage with him. They would simply ignore him if Joseph didn't do the task that he was given. That atmosphere became so damaging to him. It was sort of like a shunning. And his community mental health worker and his mother decided together that it was damaging both he and his mother. And so his mother elected to take him out and homeschool him. The second little one I want to talk with you about is Marquita. Marquita was also a young child, also 5 years old, also receiving community mental health services for anxiety and speech delays, and I suspect she may have had a trauma history as well, although that wasn't identified. Marquita is different in that she attended an urban school in an area plagued by poverty and unemployment. Marquita's mother became a mother at a very young age, and she's a single parent, and during working with her, she confided that she had struggled a lot in school herself. She had mental health issues and learning issues, and she herself was being treated for panic disorder. Marquita had very challenging behavior in school, mostly related to emotional outbursts. Tantrums is what the school would call them. And her mother became upset with the tantrums herself, so when she would try to leave Marquita at school and Marquita would have a bit of a meltdown, the school staff looked at that not as Marquita having a disability, but as Marquita being spoiled. And they were quick to tell her mother that that was the case. Marquita's mother did repeatedly request that they provide her daughter with more help, but never did that in writing. And so Marquita was not identified as eligible for special education when she first came to us, despite the fact she was getting community mental health services. The school repeatedly sent Marquita home, and they didn't usually call them suspensions because she was only in kindergarten. They would send her home for things as minor as crying too long, and because her mother didn't have any other ability to do anything, she ended up going to pick her up. Because they weren't recorded as suspensions, but Marquita wasn't there, what the district did was record them as absences. And after the absences got to a certain point, the system was automatically triggered to send a referral to truancy, and Marquita's parent received a letter in the mail with a warrant for her arrest on the truancy charges. The third student that I'd like to talk with you about is Dacron, and we have an even longer history with Dacron. We first came into contact with his mother when he was 8 years old, and he too was attending a large urban district in a city in Michigan that shall remain nameless, but you wouldn't want to drink the water there. Dacron had been retained twice and was diagnosed with ADHD. In fact, he received his medications at school, and he was well behind grade level academically. His mother sent me screen captures of the text messages that she got from his principal several times a week asking her to come and pick him up. In working with this family, we obtained his records and reviewed them and found that he had been, according to the discipline records, the disciplinary referrals that were sent home, suspended for 14 days, but none of them were recorded in the attendance as disciplinary removals. We filed a state complaint on his behalf, and as an outcome of that, he was made eligible. And we didn't hear from his mom until about midway through last year. And she called us back. Dacron was 11 years old by this time, and because even though he was eligible in his regular school, they didn't know how to provide him with appropriate supports, he continued to be removed from school. And because of that, his mother did what many people in Michigan in urban settings do. In Michigan, we have public charter schools, and there are lots of them. And so in looking for another option, parents often move their children to a public charter. When he got to the charter, he was so behind academically that even though he still had ADHD, the team decided that it was more appropriate to identify him as having a specific learning disability. And sort of like Renee noted earlier, with that came the idea that they didn't have to then address his behavior. And so instead, they moved to suspending him. And because it was a charter school with a rather strict discipline policy, they did progressive suspensions. First incident, 1 day. Next incident, 3 days of suspension. Next incident, 5 days. And so by the time she called us around Christmas time, they'd held 3 manifestation determination meetings because they knew they had to meet that requirement. But in all 3 cases said this behavior isn't related to his specific learning disability, despite the fact that his IEP noted he had ADHD and that it impacted his ability to maintain his behavior. By the time it was Christmas, he was, because of their discipline policy, actually moved to expulsion because that was the progression of the discipline in that particular school. And by the time he got to us, was only receiving 2 hours of post-expulsion services per week. I tell you about these students not because they're unusual or exceptional, but because they are so distressingly typical. If you think it's not happening in your state, I want to tell you it probably is. I talk with my other P&A colleagues, and we have very similar stories. And so I want to encourage you to think about how this letter can be helpful to us. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? Schools are still struggling to appropriately address disability-related behavior, even schools that mean well. There's a continual lack of understanding about how behavior supports properly and appropriately provided can improve outcomes. And that's what everybody wants. The parents want it, the schools want it, and our communities need it. And the guidance provides in one place in the bullet points that Renee already listed, the ways that we can work together to correct some widely held misconceptions that lead to non-compliant practices. And even more importantly, they provide this tremendous potential for improving student outcomes that we need to be able to access. I'm going to ask you to turn it to the next slide, and I am going to turn it back over to Diane. Diane, do you mind if I take a minute and talk a little bit more about Dacron?
Sure, and I think we're probably pretty close to the end of our time, so I think that'll probably be kind of wrap us up.
Okay. We wanted to talk with you a little bit about some approaches to this. In Michigan, one of the things that we've done is brought kids like this to the attention of our State Department of Education through the use of the state complaint process. And I filed a complaint on Dacron's behalf in the summer about the things, very much what Renee talked about earlier, that hadn't been done for him in his charter school. the Department of Education Michigan was in the middle of investigating this complaint when the guidance letter was issued. And I made sure that the case manager on the complaint was aware of the guidance, and they may very well have been aware of it ahead of time. But that guidance level was able to sort of help the state identify the issues that and bring it up to the school as areas that needed improvement for compliance. And in fact, the guidance letter itself was used as a component of the corrective action for the district. And the district was ordered to work together with the overseeing body, the ISD in Michigan, to come into compliance with the guidance letter in terms of their discipline practices and procedures around removal, which just made me feel greatly hopeful about the impact that it would have not only for Dacron, but for other students in that school district as well. And so with that, if Diane has anything else to add?
No, I'm good. I think you've covered everything.
So this is Carmen again. I've been monitoring the space, the chat boxes, and we do have some questions, not necessarily about Diane and Chris's presentation at the moment, but some more going back to the actual guidance. I think we're going to hold those off at the end so we can get to hear from all our speakers. We have lots of time built in to address these questions. I also just want to point out that some of the questions that are asked are outside of the scope of this presentation, which is about the guidance, and as Renee mentioned, aside from our colleagues at the P&A, the rest of us are not lawyers, so therefore we need to forward some of the questions you may have to colleagues in the department, and we'll try to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah, who's going to introduce Todd and Sharon.
Thank you, Carmen. This is Deborah Jennings from the Center for Parent Information and Resources. And now we'll have the opportunity to hear how an SEA, the SEA in Oklahoma, is partnering with their Parent Training and Information Center to directly impact schools and local education agencies and their behavior and discipline practices and procedures so that they could address what they were seeing in their data and reduce the removals and expulsions of students in their state. We're now going to hear from Todd Lofton, who's the Executive Director of Special Education Services at the Oklahoma Department of Education, and my Parent Center colleague, Sharon Coppedge-Long, who is the Executive Director at Oklahoma Parent Center. Todd and Sharon?
Okay. Hi. So I guess we'll just kind of start off by talking a little bit about what we do in general. And I mean, the data we know is not good for us. We have high suspension and expulsion rates for students with disabilities, but also all students. So it's really just a statewide problem in general, not even specific to special education. But at the SCA level, we've been developing over the past year various PD modules and self-assessments for behavior intervention. And we also, our Oklahoma Tiered Intervention System of Supports, which is funded through our SPDIG, provides trainings on both behavior and RTI. So annually we do Tier 1 and Tier 2 trainings centered on behavior. We also have a training we call Getting Started with Otis that focuses on school-wide behavior policies and procedures. And then this year we'll be doing a Tier 3, which is a 6-part PD event that includes talking about FBAs, how to write them effectively, writing effective BIPs and implementing them and reviewing them, that kind of information. We also, over the summer, had a statewide conference we called Engage OK that traveled around. It was our State Department of Ed roadshow. So we went to 6 different sites over a period of a couple weeks. We had a really high turnout, and we had Dr. Gary Duhan from Oklahoma State University, who works on our SPDIG, come to that, and he presented on positive behavior interventions and supports. And we also had Joanne Blades, who is the director of our Special Ed Resolution Center, come, and she talked more about the kind of IDEA procedural safeguard side of behavior. And we also had some school improvement staff that talked about classroom management and other sessions. But and the Oklahoma Parent Center has always been helping us with OTIS as well through our SPDIG, and helping with coaches that go into schools to provide assistance to them. We have a lot of OSU graduate students that serve in that coaching role, and we just real briefly, we do a ton of collaboration with our Parent Center. We work on the parent survey with them. We just got done finishing that up. We work on the parent. We just finished doing our parent handbook in collaboration with them. Well, basically, they just wrote it for us. And then we just include them in a lot of things. We always come to the annual conferences that they put on, and we come to the regional trainings when we can. We just have a lot of mutual trust going on between us. We refer a lot of callers to the Oklahoma Parent Center because we know in some cases that they'll be in a better position to help some parents in working with schools.
I think like 20% of our parent advising calls are directly from the Oklahoma State Department of Education. Anyway, that the OTIS grant, or SPDIG, we had that grant like 5 years ago, and so we negotiated a contract with them at that point, and we always had excess money in that. And so last year I came to the state and said, we know we expel more children with disabilities than about anybody else in the nation because we're a very red state, which I guess shouldn't matter, but it's kind of a good old boy type system. And of course they said, yes, let's do that. And we had found a PhD person from that had training from Johns Hopkins, and she was I was raised here in Oklahoma. Her name is Dr. Marianne Hubbard. And so we just contacted her, and we started doing trainings and being invited into public schools, which we had at one point had a vetted list of qualified behavioral specialists within our state that we did with the Resolution Center, the State Department, myself, and the special educators, ODS. And
that's so ODS is our Oklahoma Directors of Special Services through it's like our administrative or school administrators group, and we meet monthly with them and do a variety of things with that group as well.
So we came up with this list, this vetted list. Well, anyway, 2 years ago I was in western Oklahoma at a rural school, and a child was attending school for 30 minutes a day, and after about a 2-hour meeting we finally convinced the principal there to contract with Gary Duhon or somebody on our vetted list. Anyway, he called me back a week later and said, well, we have a PhD person from Southwestern University that does the behavior stuff. Gary Duhon trained her. Would you think that'd be okay, Sharon? I'm like, absolutely. So a week later, he then telephoned me back and said, that's the best $1,000 we ever spent. I can't thank you enough for really making us do that. And I'm like, oh, well, that's awesome. And so we had our regional conference coming up, and we have a contract with the state. They actually pay for all of our regional and our statewide conference, and asked I asked them, what do you think about Dr. Hubbard going in and doing these regionals? And it's just amazing what the parents and the professionals come back and tell us, because she understands the culture of our state and she understands our people. We, up to date, have trained over 1,500 teachers with Dr. Hubbard, and the most amazing thing I think is that the bus drivers and the cafeteria personnel are the ones that we get these amazing comments like we didn't know. And we all know that a lot of times behavior escalates during lunch or on the school bus, and so they were just so humble in thanking us for coming and doing these trainings. We do from a half day to a full day, whatever they want, whatever the district wants. And it's school-wide, yeah. We train all educators, not just special educators.
So anyway, so that's what we've been working on, and we're hoping to kind of do that more so throughout the year. And the Oklahoma Parent Center is also working with us on our state systemic improvement plan.
Yes.
and helping us provide training in other areas as well. So
yeah, it's on assistive technology, I think, and
for assistive technology and accommodations for parent awareness in those areas and training. So yeah, that's kind of our story. We've been working together for a while, and I think we've done a good job of just keeping each other up to date and keeping each other informed and part of all our various activities. Sharon and I are actually on a cadre work study that we're about to meet with our Special Ed Resolution Center, the Parent Center, and the State Department.
Yes. Anyway, we've just been amazed and astounded at the response from the classroom teachers. It's just amazing. It just is. We would be happy to share with anybody that would like those comments that we have, because as Carmen has pounded in our head, is it relevant? Is it useful? Is it high quality? Of course, we do those surveys at every training that we provide. And we find out what they think about it. So it's really good.
And we've gotten great responses on that, right?
Yes. The amount of schools that tell us we don't know what else to do is amazing regarding behavior. They truly do not know what else to do. And we're told that. So it brings up a great time to say, well, offer training and things like that. So actually we have 3 more schools that called us last week, and we've got scheduled for the next 6 weeks that we'll be doing.
Thank you so much, Todd and Sharon. So now we're going to open it up to the questions, and like I said, we have quite a few questions that have already been asked. We've been monitoring the chat box, and Renee has some notes about some of your questions. So, Renee, do you want to answer those? Do you want me to go back and find the original question?
No, I'll paraphrase.
Okay.
I'll just make up questions I want to answer. I'm teasing. I was going to say, just reiterate something Carmen said earlier, and we've been talking about having a more practice-based behavioral conversation sometime in the future, potentially, because several of these comments go beyond the scope of the Dear Colleague letter, and I don't want to get myself in more trouble than I usually do. So let me address a couple of these that have come up. A couple of questions asked, are we saying that you should always include behavioral objectives on the IEP? So that is an IEP team decision, and the Dear Colleague letter clarifies that the IEP team should consider and potentially include behavioral objectives if inappropriate behavior is resulting in the exclusion of that child from the instructional environment. So that's what we're clarifying. We're not saying they always need to be on there. If I had to answer this question as an individual, I would probably say yes, they should always be on there. But as a department, that is an IEP team decision that we're clarifying that that we hope that they consider more fully the need to include them on an IEP. There was a question about manifestation determination. I think there were a couple of them that came in, and as we said in the beginning, this Dear Colleague letter does not change any of the discipline provisions. And the manifestation determination language is in the discipline provisions, not in the earlier part of the statute and regulations that talks about structuring of IEPs. There were also a couple of questions that asked about is a behavior, are the behavior objectives, are they dependent on a certain disability category? And Chris, I loved all 3 of your stories, but I really resonated with the story about Dacron, and the presence of behavioral objectives should not be dependent on the eligibility category. So if a deafblind child, if a child with a hearing impairment, if a child with learning disabilities, if a child with intellectual disabilities has behaviors that interfere with their ability to access and be involved in instruction, then the IEP team should be considering those behavioral objectives. And parents should be at the IEP meeting asking them to consider the behavioral objectives. There was a question about the application of the Dear Colleague letter to alternative settings. Yes, the letter is applicable to both alternative and juvenile justice settings. This question went on to talk about the segregation of children with significant behavioral challenges, and there are several open cases right now where justice is really looking at states that are putting an unusual percentage of children in segregated environments due to behavioral issues. There was an additional question about on the IEP, before you consider and develop the behavioral objectives, should a functional behavioral assessment be done first? I'm going to speak out the practice side of my mouth, which I like better. Yes, a functional behavioral assessment is critical to developing an appropriate IEP, but unfortunately, the FBA language is only a requirement in the discipline section. So there is no requirement that a functional behavioral assessment be done before the IEP or the IEP objectives are developed. However, if you look at research and the evidence that's there, and we are called on to use evidence-based practices, it would be hard to make the case that you could come up with appropriate behavioral objectives for an IEP without first doing a functional behavior assessment and finding out why the child is acting in the way that they are, so that your IEP objectives are matched. There was a question about step-up or step-down programs and our thinking about that. Unfortunately, you did not put enough information in the box about this question. That's an IEP team decision. There are incidences where those are done very well. For those of you, this would be when you're increasing or decreasing a school day for to benefit the child, and I think that's what needs to be thought about here. Are we doing it for the right reasons? Is it to support the child with long-term outcomes in mind of getting them into an integrated full-day setting, or is it to keep the child out of school? So I think, like many interventions and supports, there's a good way and a bad way to do that. I think the keys that we remember here is access to and involvement in an instructional setting. And there were several questions that came in about school resource officers. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but this September 8th, both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education secretaries released Dear Colleague letters on the role of school resource officers, and clarifying that school resource officers should not be in charge of administering discipline in schools, that is a school administration responsibility. I told Carmen that in the future, if we wanted to have a more lengthy discussion about the COPS or the absenteeism letter or any of those that are behavior related in ways, and look at more practice solutions, that we could also set that up. Are there additional ones that have come in, Carmen? Or
you answered the one about functional behavioral assessment preceding the plan. This one is, can a child have a BIP that does not have an IEP, behavioral intervention plan that doesn't have an IEP?
Well, there are a lot of 504 kids that have behavior intervention plans and don't necessarily have IEPs. So I would say yes to that.
Okay. And I'm looking to see if there's any other additional questions. I think that's it for now, but if you think of other questions, please type it into the box. We do have, we're finishing quite on good time. I also wanted to say that if you have a question that we can't address because it is a legal question, we're happy to forward the question on to our correct colleagues within the department. We do need to have some sort of contact information for you so that we can get back to you with some sort of answer. So put that in your question also. Okay. And then in terms of accessing the recording, this is another question. This will be archived once it's over, but because we're also having this being transcribed at the same time, we have to then go through the transcription and make any kind of corrections. So in about a week or two, look for it on the OSEP Ideas at Work website. I want to again draw your attention to the fact that there's a handout button. If you go to the handout button, there's this PowerPoint, but in addition, you'll see a list of resources that's just links in terms of the resources that are available that can be helpful to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Deborah Jennings, who's going to talk about the resources available to help on this extremely important topic.
Thank you again, Carmen. And I also want to thank all of our presenters for providing us with this information about how we can address issues of behavior and discipline when we are working with our families and with students with disabilities, and especially in working directly with the education systems at the school, state, and local level. My Parent Center colleagues were really pleased to see the guidance, especially because for most of us, student suspensions, formal and informal, would be in really the top 3 or top 5 of all of the issues that we have parents reaching out to us regarding. And so we think that this guidance is going to really be helpful for us in terms of providing some assistance and direction for families, but also in our work with local school districts. The parent centers are in IDEA and have been for almost 40 years now. Our first parent center was founded just over 30-some years ago. And just last year, we, through training and individual assistance, had over 650,000 contacts. And also, at the same time, we were involved in systems change at the state, local, and federal levels, attending over 14,000 meetings, because our direction from IDEA is not only to help prepare parents to advocate for their children with disabilities, but also to impact education systems and other systems like early intervention that are serving infants, toddlers, children, and youth. There are almost 90 parent centers nationwide, and there's at least one in every state and a number of the territories. Next slide. If you're not familiar with parent centers, there are actually 2 types that you may have heard of. The first is parent training and information centers, and these parent training and information centers are often statewide programs. They are operated by independent nonprofit organizations where the majority of the boards of directors are parents of children with disabilities birth to 26. And we have at least one statewide project in every state, and some of the larger states like California, Texas, Florida have more than one, and they are organized around certain regions. There's also a network of community parent resource centers, and these centers are really focused on reaching underserved families in particular communities based on geography and or the communities are, because of race, ethnicity, language, are underserved, and in terms of the services for children with disabilities. You can find your center right at parentcenterhub.org, and there's a button where you can click and you can find the center in your state. Next slide. You should also know that the parent centers are supported with this network of support, and because we want to make sure that parent centers are able to focus their energy and their resources on actually reaching and serving families and impacting the lives of children. There's 3 national centers, the Center for Parent Information and Resources, which serves as a central hub and in providing materials and tools for the parent centers, but also for many of you because we have a range of topics and a range of types of information that's available there, including a monthly newsletter and a number of other kinds of resources. The other national centers, one is serving the needs of parent centers around how they can better reach and serve Native American families with children with disabilities, and that's at NAPTAC. And then there's the branch, which is a special parent training and information center support around military families. In addition, we have 6 regions where we have regional TA centers who are really working more directly with the centers around ways that they can best improve their services and their practices. Next slide. For this particular topic and for this webinar, we have pulled together from parentcenterhub.org a number of resources that are relevant to supporting the behavior of students with disabilities. The first is a handout that we prepared, and it's really specifically to sort of guide people through the kinds of resources that are available that are directly linked to the issues and topics addressed in the Dear Colleague letter. And then we have what we call our behavior suite, which is, again, resources that you can access around working with students and systems around behavior. And then we also have a resource around that addresses student placement and school discipline and what that means, particularly as it relates to the planning and implementation of the IEP. Next slide. A number of our resources are resources that migrated over to Parent Center Hub from the National Dissemination Center, which was known as NICHE, and it includes the modules that were developed around IDEA 2004, and while it's now 2016, these modules are still relevant and really up to date, and they are a wonderful curriculum that you can adapt or adopt in providing training for professionals, for parents, for your staff around the discipline requirements under IDEA. And we also have the Discipline in Detail resource that provides additional information around the provisions in IDEA around discipline. Next page. Next slide, okay. And then if for some reason those resources are not pointing you in the right direction, you can always search through our Parent Center Hub either by topic, or you can also search via a keyword search. And we do have a lot of great resources, and you can find them, you know, by language. We have a number of resources in Spanish, and also in terms of by audience for parents, professionals, etc., and also as it relates to formats and how and which organizations or types of organizations provided them. Next slide. And I think this is you, Carmen. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. We have here another link on some other resources that are related to discipline, which have to do with chronic absenteeism, and these are all resources that the Department of Education has put out. To give you a little primer for those of you who are not used to using GoToWebinar, if you see something called Handouts, you have to press on the plus button and you'll see the 2 handouts that are available with this webinar, the PowerPoint slides themselves, and then a Word document that has a list of all the resources everybody has already mentioned. We will again be archiving this. If you do a Google search for OSEP ideas that work, that will lead you to I believe that is the URL. OSEPideas.work.org is the URL for where this will be eventually archived. I am looking through, and it doesn't look like we have any other questions right now. Feel free to submit your questions to any of the presenters. You have their most of their contact information here. You also can feel free to send me an email, and I can forward some questions on to colleagues here in the department, and that's simply my name, Carmen.Sanchez@ed.gov. And again, I want to thank everybody for participation on this webinar, because I think this has been very informative. And one of the things that really struck me on the webinar was the comment that Chris made about how this guidance is already having an effect. It's already having an effect in the lives of real students and real families, as the guidance is shared with school districts, is shared with families, and that people are thinking about how to improve behavior and providing the appropriate behavioral supports to all students. So we look forward to that happening again. So again, they will be recorded at OSEPideas.work.org. OSEPideas.work.org, one big word. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Thanks again to all the presenters.